you show up at a startup and it's time to like do research, and you're like, well, I know this like 3-month process, but I have 2 days to do it. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, we'll gather all these people and we'll interview them and we'll like make like storyboards and personas and we'll like build prototypes and iterate. And you're like, no, we need something like tomorrow. And you start cutting, right? And you're like, and like a lot of it, it's terrible to say, or not terrible to say, but it's probably not what my design professors love to hear. Is a lot of it is intuition based, which helps because we're living with these things day in and day out. It changes a lot. And I had a great conversation yesterday for somebody who was doing design for seniors, and obviously you can't just be like, oh, I think this is what they want, done. So it helps that we're building products that we are at least a core user group of, and that's a lot of what's informed us as well. But the parts that I've ended up finding really valuable from the design process, one of them is prototyping, which we've talked about earlier, and the other one is just the incorporation of user feedback as early as possible. And for us, that tends to come through our community team. So they're not just doing support; there are ears on the ground, and they can come up and say, this feature we launched, like it's getting this reaction, or we'll tweak an algorithm. People notice instantly. They'll say like, no, like new popular page algorithm people are not so into, and that kind of like iteration feeding back into the engineering team is really important because you can lose track of that. I worked at a unnamed big company. I remember at the beginning of a 3-year process, they would say, here's all the user research we've done for the last 2 years. Like, let's go build product. And like, how much of that changes in the next 2 years? And like, you might have totally missed the train on something that happened in the meantime.
I think it's interesting that Instagram, FourSquare, and FoodSpotting are all products that are very much vision-driven and very much intuition-driven in a lot of ways. And I think there's something that is important to that. I think there's a lot of talk in the lean startup about kind of measuring every little thing that you do and measuring every button and making sure it's optimized. And I think there's definitely value in that kind of optimization. But I also think that if you focus so much on the details, it's easy to lose sight of the big vision, like what's that experience you're trying to create? What's that ultimate experience you're trying to create? The picture menu for every restaurant, or the thing that makes the real world easier to use. And I think that users wouldn't necessarily guess those things if you asked them what they wanted. And a lot of times, user feedback will be coming from super users and power users who aren't actually the average user of your product. And so I think it's really important to balance user feedback with, the vision for your startup, and never pivot away from your vision. Only pivot how you do it based on user feedback. But stick to that vision of the problem you're trying to solve and the ultimate solution.
And since you mentioned super users, one of the things that I've noticed is that there's these other roles that maybe we don't consider, user research with that formal title, but super user being one of them. And maybe Alex, talk a little bit about some of these other folks that are really telling you about the people that use your products.
Sure. So super users have played a big role for FourSquare since day one, and like a lot of our venue database that other apps use largely is curated by FourSquare super users. That early on, we would be able to tell, like, okay, this guy uses the app a lot, like make them a super user. Like they're writing us and they're like, I want to help like make the venues in my city better. So we make them a super user, and then they get special access to the venue database to help us curate it and help us keep it up to date. And I think that's resulted in our venue database being super, super current. And I think like Dennis spoke about this at his keynote yesterday. Like if there's a restaurant that shuts down, some FourSquare super user will go in there and mark it as closed, and then the moment that a new restaurant pops up there, it'll show up in the venue database because someone will add it. And so we've started to, in the past year, really started to try and build more tools for our super users because they help us do everything with the venue database. We're now trying to use them to help us with some translations in other languages that we're trying to get. And they're just a great extension of the community team, and just ears on the ground to know like what's resonating with people, what isn't resonating with people. And it's people that care about the product as much and sometimes more than as our team. And so it's been a challenge to figure out how to build tools for them while we're trying to build other stuff. But being able to do so really has inspired them and allowed them to do what they want to do to make the product better.
And Mike, so there's 12 people at Instagram, and 4 of those are community managers. And so when I heard that, I was like, so what's going on? Like, what are these guys doing? So I talked to Jess Fisselman, one of the 4 community managers, and I was kind of shocked at how much of a researchy kind of position she has. Designers actually come to her for feedback, that sort of thing. So maybe talk about that role and kind of this, kind of the user research.
Yeah, it was our first hire. So we launched, and instantly we were like overwhelmed. I still remember that. I didn't know Gmail's like unread counter could go that high because we were getting both like server alerts and user feedback on the first day we launched. I remember just like hitting select all and archive. I'm like, I can't deal with this. But the first hire we made was Josh, who's our first community manager, and we live in like the technology behind like making your photos look better is interesting, but ultimately we live and die by our community. And designing that is really the community manager's role. So everything from hearing complaints and listening to feedback to just being the voice on the team. And I think later the PM starts filling that role or a user researcher. But I've seen engineers go up to them all the time and be like, "We're building this. Like, what are they going to think?" And they know because they interact with them. They probably interact with a couple hundred users a day through email and Twitter and all those things.
Yeah.
So.
Actually, talk about that. I mean, there's feedback coming from every which way. Right? There's Twitter, there's customer service, and there's a lot of noise. Like, how do you figure out like who to listen to? What the most important things are for like the next 3 weeks versus a year out.
It's actually really similar to user research, I think. In user research, like you hear something once and you note it. You hear something twice and you think it's interesting, and the third time it's like this is actually a thing. You interview enough people for that to be a real thing, and that happens at scale too. Like if somebody has my phone the app doesn't work. My phone in Norway. I'm like it's one guy. But like like there's 30 people who are complaining about this morning. Like the team will ping us immediately and we'll get on there and we'll try to figure out what's going on. So it's really the aggregation that's helpful.
And that's what makes for a great community team. It are people that can read those nuances and know like, okay, like I know that that's going on, but we're going to wait until it's a certain point to know that it's something that we could do about. And so to figure out when to communicate with the product team or the engineering team to be like, this is a fire that we need to fix right now, or this is something we just need to monitor, and to be able to know the difference between those things has been really valuable for us.
I think speaking of kind of non-traditional user research in startups, kind of responding to, or like listening to the pulse of your community can really tell you what matters to people and what they use and don't use. One thing that Dave McClure always says is to try this experiment of killing a feature. Like every week, take one of your features of your site and just bring it down, or your site or your app and bring it down. And if nobody complains and nobody says anything about it, it probably wasn't a feature anybody used anyway, and you should stop working on it altogether. And sometimes we've thought that was kind of funny because like a feature will go down on FoodSpotting, like, gee, this guide thing is not working, this delete thing is not working. We realize that nobody cares. Nobody's saying anything, and normally they would. And so it kind of can tell you actually what people don't care about as well.